Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Even on a budget, quality is non-negotiable. That's why Quince is the place to score high-end essentials at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Get your hands on buttery soft cashmere sweaters from just $60, Italian leather jackets, and so much more. And the best part about Quince, they exclusively partner with factories committed to safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Elevate your style without the elevated price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Before we get into this new installment of the show, I have to pause and say a few words of thanks. Many of you've reached out in the past 6 weeks with messages of support and good wishes, and whilst I may not have responded to a number of them, I want you to know that they have meant a huge amount. The continued sharing of the love, whether it's been messages, reviews, or downloads, has been a humbling reminder of what this podcast has always been about: building a Napoleonicist community around the world. On my side, after a considerable amount of rest and a lot of reflection and self-improvement, I'm now in a much better place, probably the best place that I've been in with my mental health for years. Priorities sorted, research going well, writing happening, and focusing on what really matters. This doesn't mean a return to business as it was pre-Christmas. My focus is now on longevity rather than milestone chasing. And that's going to mean me producing essentially what I want to and when, rather than pressuring myself to feed the insatiable beast that is content creation. I want to take the time to explore different styles, options, and formats, which I'll say more about when I'm ready. Once again, though, I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for your support. As we bear down on the 4th anniversary of this show's first broadcast, the engagement is stronger than ever, with literally hundreds of you tuning in daily and thousands of you subscribing in every continent. You are this show's success and its reason for being. Thank you for continuing to join me on the journey. Now, on with the show. The word Waterloo is littered across the landscape, not just of the United Kingdom, but the entire world. Towns, cities, streets, bridges, schools, you name it, and there's probably an example of it with Waterloo daubed on the side. Why? How did we get to that point? What was it that made people in far-flung corners of the world give a monkeys about a battlefield in a distant corner of Europe? The simple answer? The British Empire. In this episode, Dr. Luke Reynolds, friend of the show and critically acclaimed author of Who Owned Waterloo, celebrates the release of the paperback version of that book in the US by giving us a sneak preview of what might just go on to become his third title. We don't hold back in this one, taking a blunt approach to the fact that studying empire is complex and at times deeply unpleasant, whilst also poking fun at the way that Waterloo Day basically became a shorthand for having a monumental boozing session. Luke is in characteristically good form for this one, and if you haven't already got your hands on a copy of Who Owned Waterloo, I'd urge you to rectify that by heading to the Oxford University Press website, where you can save 30% by quoting code AAFLYG6. Once again, that's 30% off at Oxford University Press's website by quoting the following code: Alpha Alpha Foxtrot Lima Yankee Golf 6. This is Waterloo Around the World, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. I am joined by the mighty, yes, mighty is indeed the word, Dr. Luke Reynolds. So you know full well that with Dr. Memory, as I tend to call him in the house, we are going back down that dizzying road full of surprises, slightly bonkers things, tat, because I'm going to be honest, some of it is just plain tat. But we're doing this slightly differently. We're going to look at how Waterloo was remembered, commemorated, and in some cases rammed down people's throats across the British Empire. If you don't know Luke already, then you need to listen to the back catalogue and come out from underneath the rock from which you've been hiding. He is visiting assistant professor at the University of Connecticut and is author of the critically acclaimed, yes, it is critically acclaimed, I've said it and I will hear no arguments, the critically acclaimed Who Owned Waterloo. It won the SMH First Book Prize. It was runner-up for the Society of Army Historical Research First Book Prize. Frankly, if it doesn't get shortlisted for the Wellington Medal from Rusey, a crime has been committed. I'm not saying that to jinx it. I'm saying it because it's true, not that the judging panel have the slightest. They probably don't even know this podcast exists, so it's not like this is going to influence them. But it's true. It's a brilliant book. The number of kind of testimonials that have come in about it is very telling about its quality. Luke, good to see you again, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm well, Zach. Thank you for having me. I'm just in the process of deciding whether Dr. Memory is my superhero name or my supervillain name.
Definitely supervillain name.
That's fair.
With the slicked back hair, I think you can kind of pull off the suave villain look. I
Live
think
with that.
that suits you.
Yeah, I need one of those high-necked sort of Nehru pseudo uniform jackets.
Yeah, but I think you need to go for the Van Dyke beard to complete the sort of supervillain look. We'll work on that. We'll discuss your kind of sartorial outlook after the show.
Fair
So
enough.
let's talk Empire and Waterloo during this period. This could go in so many directions. It actually makes my brain hurt. So I'm going to be really basic and just start with the beginning because I'm unimaginative like that. And just talk about the sort of the breaking news element of Waterloo. There is actually a really good book out that talks about that race to try and get the news back to the UK. It's really quite remarkable and dastardly and entertaining. But that's to get the news back to the UK. Once it's broken in the UK, then of course, obviously it becomes old news to everybody in the home islands. But there's still the need to get the word out everywhere else. And that's not to say that everybody's going, oh, the war's over on the 19th of June. Of course, they're not. But nonetheless, news needs to go out that there's been a great victory. It's a propaganda element to all of this. And the Brits are pretty adept at propaganda when they want to be. So how does this work in terms of getting the word out, first of all? And what's the reaction like? Because I feel that it's very easy to put together this narrative that there could be some seriously unimpressed native populations that just sort of shrug about this. Great. So these white people who have come in, invaded, killed our families in the course of that invasion, and are now telling us how we live our lives, have gone and beaten some other white people in a country a long way away. How does this affect us? So talk us through the reception of that news as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're dead on, right? And especially in places like India, you are genuinely talking about a native population that is hearing the news of a battle between two of their oppressors, right? There's been wars being fought in India, whether it's going to be British or French hegemony. And so, yeah, it's pretty easy to imagine, sort of people in, say, Seringapatam or the Maratha states sort of going, where? Who? What? Okay. There is not, at least that I have found, that level of, race to tell the news. And, that the books that you've mentioned on that point do also make it clear that, one of the big things about that was, getting a business advantage, right? It changes the economic world fundamentally, or at least, allows them to then short stocks of ammunition and things like that. It's less breakneck and less cutthroat. I think a lot of the world genuinely finds out about it in pretty much the standard way when the local colonial newspapers reprint whole extracts of the British newspapers. And for those of you who don't know your media history in this period, this is a pretty standard thing. You just get on both sides of any colonial divide, you get newspapers reprinting whole chunks of each other. And usually they're pretty good about sort of, saying this is an extract from, say, the Caledonian Mercury or, the Ottawa Gazette or something like that. But it is just sort of lift and drop, right? We're not dealing with copyright or bylines. We're fundamentally dealing with an entire press corps that views itself as the Associated Press, that everything can just grab everything else.
And in fairness, that's not actually unique to colony and metropole relations. That's happening provincially as well. Within the home counties, the London papers do their thing, and then that sort of trickles down. So it's very much just kind of part and parcel of how newspapers operate during this period.
Absolutely, and it goes both ways, even in the home counties. There's open up a London society paper, and within 5 issues, you'll find a story about someone doing something stupid in Dublin, right? And it's taken from a Dublin newspaper, so it does go back and forth. So I really do think a lot of it is going out in the standard way. The people who are going to be most interested in this, in all honesty, especially in certain places, are going to be the military, because whether France or Britain or whether the Allies or Napoleon wins at Waterloo isn't going to have an immediate effect on someone living of a civilian living in, say, West Africa or the Cape or anything like that. But it may have a pretty immediate effect on a garrison that's stationed there, or especially garrisons that have been sent there because of what's going on, right? Wellington doesn't have the army he wants at Waterloo because the War of 1812 is still going on. So there's going to be that aspect to it. In terms of first sort of responses and first reactions, the early stuff that we get is actually reporting on colonial contributions to the Waterloo Fund and colonial sort of raising their own funds. So the first mention I found actually is bloody quick, but the civilians in Halifax in Canada raise £4,000 by September of 1815 for the widows and orphans and the disadvantaged. There's another report that comes again in a British newspaper, but comes of fund, not actually contributions to the Waterloo Fund itself, but a separate fund being raised in India, 40,000 silver rupees in Calcutta and 10,000 pagodas in Madras that are raised for, sort of for those who fell at Waterloo and for those who are left. Actually, you'll appreciate this, Zach. Both of those funds are sent privately and directly to the Duke of Wellington, because it's assumed that he's the best person to then spread that money and that largesse around. I will say this, in credit to Wellington, there is no mention there of a scandal that he pockets it or anything. He probably just picks it up and drops it right into the War Office and says, "I'm too busy to deal with this." Especially since in July of 1816, he's in France commanding an army of occupation. And then
on that, actually, are there any sort of mini scandals that develop around the Waterloo Fund? People just sort of quietly taking a bit because, money disappears on journeys sometimes.
It's less about sort of skimming off the top and more the scandals that emerge are about, who gets what, how much they get. All of the reform newspapers are having a field day with how much Wellington gets of the prize money versus how much an average private gets of the prize money, and all of that. If you want by far the best take on the fund that I've ever encountered, there was a PhD student by the name of Elisa Milks, Milkes. Who wrote an entire PhD dissertation at Yale on that's basically the social version of what I do on the cultural side. And she has a superb breakdown of the Waterloo Fund. So for anyone who's really interested in that, That's where I would point you to. I would also obviously point you to Evan Wilson's new horrible piece, which is going to go into that a little bit. So yeah, back to the fund and things like that. The next contribution I've actually found comes from Africa, comes from West Africa. Two colonies, Demerara and Berbice, which are then amalgamated as British Guiana, and that's in 1818. Africa is also, really interestingly, the first place I've found a imperial commemoration. There's an 1818 dinner by the Sierra Leone garrison that sort of is, salutes several people that were there and several regiments that were there. And actually, because they invite some local civilians, they invite a Prussian clergyman, and so they have to drink a toast to Blücher. Because they're honoring him, and he gives the thanks as sort of the token Prussian. Sierra Leone also sees the next year, 1819, the founding of a city of Waterloo. And I really like to think that the idea for that city came about at that dinner. A whole bunch of drunken officers sitting around going, how do we make this regular? How do we commemorate this? I know, we'll name a city after the battle.
So on that, is there a kind of, and because as we know, the name Waterloo ends up, and Wellington ends up littering not only the UK landscape, but also the colonial landscape as it is back then. Wellington clearly being the name of a very significant city, but it makes the point, doesn't it, that the name ends up being pinned on many things. Do we know if there's this sort of effort of one-upmanship? In place X they've done this, so therefore we need to do Y.
Not really. You don't really see that level of rivalry. But what you do see is a lot of places, especially these new Victorian cities, right, that are building these streets, and we got to name them something. And so it becomes really common for there to be a Wellington and a Waterloo. There's a Waterloo Hotel in Hong Kong. There is obviously Wellington, New Zealand. I think there's about 10 towns in the United States named Waterloo that emerged. Yeah, I did a search through a bunch of post office registries.
Why? How? Why?
They like the name. They like the name. There's a couple of expats hanging out there. One of my favorite examples of this, and this does feed in really nicely to this, is there ends up being a Waterloo tea room in New York. And there is a British tourist who shows up there at one point and looks at it and records in his sort of travel log that he would lay money down that this is named Waterloo not to commemorate the battle, but to convince British tourists to come and spend money at this tea room. I think the actual line is, "This name is here to lighten the pockets of John Bull."
Does that work as a business model?
It wouldn't surprise me, honestly, given the amount of Brits that are in and out of New York. It is sort of it's the staging post, right? It's where they all arrive if they're going to travel across the United States, and a lot of them do end up staying there. And yeah, there's that moment of sort of, well, we've got to support this, we've got to be there, and yeah, it genuinely wouldn't surprise me.
Okay, so we've got some unimpressed native populations. We've got this news of a great big thumping victory over one collection of white nations over another white nation. The people, some people turning around and going big deal, the army going hoorah, or whatever the well, I suppose it's huzzah is the 19th century equivalent, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So you've got a lot of sort of perhaps that's where to go with this next question. Is there a lot of sort of the army ramming Waterloo down people's throats? And to what extent does that grate on people? Because I'm very conscious that, and back then they were exceptionally conscious that this control that they have over the empire is not a given. Britain is acutely conscious of the very messy divorce that it just went through with the USA. They are terrified about the prospect of losing control in India, and the manner in which that makes people absolutely beholden to the sepoys of the East India Company is fascinating, and that there are books written about this, but there are whole books that can still be written on that topic. So when the army's sort of going around going, yeah, look, aren't we brilliant? How much of that is sort of, look, we're amazing, you don't want to mess with us? How much of that is just, look, this is what armies do. You know, they've got a success to celebrate. Their comrades have gone and done a thing, and they're going to celebrate it. And equally, how much does all of this sort of grate on people?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an aspect of that. Within the military itself, I get the feeling it is actually genuinely less about establishing control and aren't we brilliant, especially at the beginning, and much more about our soldiers are stuck often in the middle of nowhere. They have nothing to look forward to. Let's throw a party on June 18th that allows them to be special, and it's a deviation from the usual day, and all of that. So reading between the lines, I do get the feeling it is, especially for the army, at the beginning, very much about marking this, and it's for internal morale rather than external domination. With the understanding that if internal morale goes to pot, then external damnation will also go to pot. The fund reports that I've mentioned, right, very much have a hint of we've maintained control about them, right? The empire continues; it is still glorious. And actually, the ones from Sierra Leone, the garrison dinner, all the reports that I found of that actually presage it not with "this is Waterloo," but look, we have an English language newspaper in the west of Africa. That's amazing. The empire is doing so well. And that's really what they're delighted about and sort of highlighting. And then they highlight Waterloo as part of it. I mean, regular listeners to your podcast don't need to be told that the British Empire they're feeling the stretch right at this moment, right? Evan Wilson, in his Horrible Peace interview, did a superb breakdown of this. And others have talked about this. Hugh Davies and Beatrice de Graaf have both made the point that sort of English British interests in the Congress of Vienna and in the Peace of Paris, and their push to not destroy France entirely, are about creating a balance of power so they can concentrate on their Blue Water Empire, because they know that they can't rule the world if they're trying to police Europe. It's kind of a one or the other thing. So there's definitely that feeling of sort of, we need to push through this. Are there people who are resentful of this? Are there people who don't care about this? 100%. There are also going to be people that are sitting there. I mean, this is the classic, and you get this in the UK too, of sort of, why are we spending money on this? Why do we care? Why are we throwing these parties? There are a few examples of using the other side of it. The Australasian League, which is founded to object to the idea of transportation, right? It's basically saying, hey, Australia is a legitimate colony now. Please stop sending us your worst and start sending us your best. They actually deliberately stage a protest on Waterloo Day. To sort of push back against this. There's a hilarious article in the Sydney Monitor about basically having to defend the government buildings from this crowd. But it is very clear that they do deliberately choose this day, right? And that is part of this. But yeah, I think for the military, it is about breaking up monotony, and it is about boosting morale, at least in the start. There are other aspects that will, of course, come through as we move on. But yeah, I think to start with, like, for example, that dinner in 1818 in Sierra Leone could very easily just have been, we need an excuse to crack open a new case of Madeira, and the June 18th is coming up, and you get views of basically like, let's find what excuses we can. There's a Waterloo celebration in Hobart, the capital of Tasmania, that goes so well that the newspaper turns around the next day and is like, great, we're doing this for Trafalgar in a couple of months.
Where there's a market opportunity for people to get drunk, you will find people who will exploit said opportunity. That's brilliant. I love it. Now we're going to sort of go on a bit of an imperial tour. Is that even a dangerous phrase to use? I'm not sure, but we've gone with it now. So we'll stick with imperial tour, and apologies for any offence caused. From the chat that we had prior to this, yes, folks, we do actually like plan these episodes. I don't just rock up and fire the first thing that comes into my head at people, because the show would be even worse than it already is if I did. But from that discussion that we had, I gather there's quite a lot that's distinctive, I think it's fair to say, in terms of what happens out in Australia when it comes to remembering Waterloo. Talk us through what happens.
Yeah, so Australia becomes one of the center points of this, and part of it is that they are, half a world away from Britain. They are feeling that pinch, and I think part of it is also that they do develop into it becomes, and again, another very deeply problematic phrase, along with imperial tour. We're going to throw in another one here with white dominion, which is one of the classics. But they are desperate to try and demonstrate that they are. All right, another problematic one, right? That in their minds they're more advanced than other colonies, right? That they are more European, that they're more white, that they're more Anglo-centric. And that drives this. And part of this, keep in mind, right? Part of this is research bias, right? I know a lot about Australia because Australia is trying to do this, and therefore they have a lot of English language newspapers that preserve this stuff. So I've got a better source base coming out of this. And that's one of the reasons why I've signaled out Australia. Australia has a couple of really interesting developments, though. So it really gets going in the 20s and 30s, right? And press coverage starts to accelerate from the late 20s on. It's that phenomenon of what actually comes first. Is it the commemoration, and then they start writing about it, and more people are like, "Oh, this is a great idea," or there's a lot of commemoration, and the press finally catches on. It's the whole chicken and the egg thing. Civilian commemoration, just to tie into exactly what we've been saying, is centered around taverns. The two sort of capitals of this in Sydney are the Canning Tavern and then the Cricketers' Arms, both of which are run by veterans. Although the Australian newspapers can never seem to decide what regiment they fought for. It's one of those messy, very messy situations. But the Cricketers' Arms becomes so recognized to this that newspapers actually genuinely start referring to it as the Antipodean Apsley House around the Waterloo anniversary.
When it comes to not being able to work out which regiment these guys served in, is it perhaps the case that they're that particular type of person, and we all know somebody like this who's been in the army and won't stop going on about the fact that they've been in the army, and in the process they spend so many yarns that one minute they're in the 71st, and the next minute they're in the 95th, and the next they've pretty much served in as a cavalryman, an artilleryman, and an engineer as well. Yeah. Is that perhaps what goes on there?
I think it very well might be. I have found in the same year articles in Sydney's papers that attribute the service of the landlord of the Cricketers' Arms, a man by the name of Green, to both the Lifeguards and the Coldstream Guards. You'll note, by the way, that both of those are incredibly illustrious regiments. So, yeah, take what you want from that.
I mean, he's not pretending to be in the Connaught Rangers, is he? Let's be honest.
Oh, I don't know. The Devil's Own has their own particular elan about them.
Sorry, I cut you off mid-flow in that, and that was unkind of me, but I've got zero regrets.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, we see taverns become the center, right? And it starts as dinners, and they are largely civilian, but we do see some permeation, right? So for example, in the 1841 Cricketers' Arms dinner, the guests are entertained by the full band of the 28th Regiment of Foot, the North Gloucestershire, who are sort of on loan from the barracks. As these get more popular, they actually go from dinners to balls, because balls automatically fit more people than a sit-down dinner does. And they do sort of, you end up with, sort of several hundred at these events, which is not bad for the population of Sydney in the 1840s. The military commemoration tends to, first of all, be much more public than it is in Britain, right? In Britain, it starts public, right? We have parades and things like that, but it then becomes much more private. In the Empire, it stays public, but it is still centered very much around barracks and garrisons, right? So by 34, the residents of Sydney have come to expect at least a partial illumination of the barracks. The Sydney Monitor actually complains when it's left dark. Basically sort of, why are the walls dark when we were trying to commemorate this extraordinary victory?
So apologies, I know I keep chipping in, and this is really kind of unkind of me, but I know you can handle it. So, I'm less apologetic than perhaps I should be. Is that is it viewed in kind of, this is dishonorable? Here we are sort of as honorable citizens of Britain, trying to celebrate our illustrious, kind of collective history, and the army's not doing its bit, and this is disgraceful. Is that the sort of the terminology that's used? Obviously, I'm guessing here.
Yeah,
I'm curious about the phrasing and how it's expressed.
No, it absolutely is. Let me find this for you. Here we go. This is domestic intelligence from the Sydney Monitor. Yesterday was the 12th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, a day great in the annals of Europe and a proud one in English history. Custom and a natural feeling of conscious superiority among those who remember the merits of the eventful 18th June have in most garrisons celebrated the day with rejoicing and a dinner among officers and privates. We do not hear, however, that such honor has been paid by the garrison of Sydney. And that's, by the way, that's not 34 for those of you who can do the math. It's 27, just so you don't have comments going sort of, who is this hack who doesn't even know what year is 12 years after 1815?
Look, you're a historian, not a mathematician. We can let you off the hook. Don't worry.
I actually always open my first day of teaching, make sure everyone's in the same class. I tell them, here's what we're doing, and then I stop and say, no one expects me to teach them calculus. Good, all right, we can go on.
It's a long time since anybody mentioned calculus to me. Very long time. We digress.
And long may it continue.
Yeah, too right. I can't even remember what calculus was all about. Apologies, Mr. Oates. Not that Mr. Oates is listening. But yes, I was taught by a guy who'd been to Oxford and had that sort of air of an Oxford Don. It was really quite baffling. Anyway,
did he wear his gown?
Waterloo. No, he didn't. The headmaster wore the gown, but usually only for assemblies. And we were all quite baffled by this. Even more baffled, incidentally, when there was a change of headmaster and the new guy had a PhD in chemistry, and he basically walked on in colours that looked like the West Ham kit. Not that I knew what the West Ham kit looked like, but everybody was cracking jokes about it. So that was my induction into what the West Ham kit looked like. But yeah, we're a long way from Australia and Waterloo. Let's get back on topic.
So, military commemoration is centered around barracks and garrisons. They have illuminations. There are often fireworks because where there is a large store of gunpowder, people will make fireworks out of them. Let's be real here. There's often dinners. Usually in Sydney, at least, you want to talk about the sort of the English caste system in one sentence. There were barracks dinners for officers and pub crawls around Sydney for the enlisted men. Complete with reports of delight that no one got drunk and started a fight. Right? We're so proud of our men who behaved well. There is that patronizing tone there as well.
Are you sure they were really partying that hard if they didn't get pissed? I mean, these are redcoats.
I know. I'm sure they got pissed, but I think it was, they didn't break anything, and that's the line.
Normally it's the officers that start breaking things if the Peninsula was anything to go by.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no reports from, whether they can keep shtum about what happens inside the barracks, right? So that's the key. One of my favorites from this is the Australian, which is another Sydney paper in 1837, which praises the ingeniousness of the garrison, reporting that, and I quote, "Those regiments which were present at the sanguinary contest sported green wreaths of various kinds on the occasion, laurel not being obtainable."
Quick, find something green. Anything will do.
Yeah, and I do genuinely get the obviously this is inaccurate, but I do genuinely get this sort of picture of an arts and crafts day in the barracks with all of them with their green construction paper cutting out laurel wreaths.
Has anyone got some green cloth?
Right? Yeah. The other big tradition that starts is the 18th of June becomes a day when the army in Australia announces promotions, sort of an honors list, a military honors list, to the point where you start to get a shorthand that in the paper they're just referred to as Waterloo Day promotions.
How does the authorization for that work? Sorry, that's a
I,
deeply technical question, but
I
I
think I
mean,
think it basically comes in and they hold it until so they gather a whole bunch of them and then drop them at once.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's an interesting concept because horse guards perhaps wouldn't be overly keen on that as a way of doing things. You promote somebody at a particular time.
It also
And that,
pays merry hell with the seniority listings if they're all announced at the same time.
yeah, that's exactly where I'm going with it. That
Yeah.
actually you've got all of these people who have commissions at different dates, and yet if you elevate them all on the same day, sure, the army does that. If you go through the list, then yeah, there is quite clearly certain days where people get kicked up a level. Yet if you're going to hold everybody in terms of the announcement, that's a problem. Because Horse Guard's list of when that happened, it is therefore different to what's happening out in the colonies. So then you've got all kinds of issues of local rank versus true rank and all sorts of things.
So my instinct is that the promotions they go into effect at the date that Horse Guards puts them into effect, but they are announced to the Australian public. They send out a big newspaper bulletin, for example, because the average Australian cannot afford to ship in a copy of the Gazette, right? That's just ridiculous. So I have a feeling that's what's going on. But you do get these sort of, who's made a sergeant on Waterloo Day, who was, elevated to captain on Waterloo Day.
That's really interesting. I want to talk about agendas here, and we have sort of dabbled in this, but I want to probe a bit deeper. And I'm sort of going to do almost like a sort of Linda Colley style of question. So for folks, I know I have mentioned this in previous episodes, but in case people haven't picked it up, Linda Colley is one of the people who wrote a book in, I believe it was 1993, called Britons. And it was basically about the forging of British national identity in very heavily emphasized inverted commas. And one of the things that has often been drawn upon is the way in which conflict and the experience of war is drawn upon as a way of trying to bring nations together and forge an idea of what it means to be, in our case, British, in other nations' cases, French or whatever it might be. And I'm interested about the extent to which, when you look at the efforts of commemoration here, again, I suppose we're talking a sort of chicken and egg scenario, in the sense that are we seeing a sort of an effort to reinforce the bonds of empire by, look, we've all got this shared history. You're all part of this collective. We, as Britain, can take on the best that Europe has to offer and win. So you want to be on our side anyway, and kind of stuff that down to people's throats and use that as a more sort of nefarious way of saying, look, here are the benefits of empire, but doing it in a sort of subtle sense. But equally, if you're out in the colonies and you're trying to curry favor, if you're the governor of a colony, it looks good if you can turn around and say, look, things are going so well out here, thanks to my supervision, that actually these are the celebrations. There's this great sort of, we can't call it patriotic feeling because that ties to nation, but there's this sort of great support for the imperial, inverted commas, mission. What's at play there, or is it actually both and more things besides?
Yeah, I mean, it's both and more things besides. There's absolutely the individual drive. There's 100% there. I mean, you don't become a colonial governor without being ambitious in one sense or another, right? There are absolutely people who are colonial governors because they are ambitious and military, and they get into that position. They're like, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just going to happily let my clerks do everything while I sit back and, again, drink Madeira and port. There's a theme today, guys. But but yeah, no, there's absolutely that, right? There is this an attempt to forge this shared sense of Britishness, both in a national and an imperial identity. And the need for that reinforcement actually overrides other social, professional, or geographic divides that dominate commemoration and life in Britain itself. So we get that sort of traditional imperial compression. English, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh become British. There are even places, Hong Kong is an amazing example of this, where the Europeans are so outnumbered that basically anyone who's white is welcomed into the fold. Right, there are parties that are sort of, for great British events where the French, the Americans, the Germans, the Russians are all invited because they are Europeans, whites, that sort of thing. And the lines also between civilian and military socially blur and become more permeable. So one of I have two examples of this that I really like to talk about in the Australian context. One is very short, one's a little bit longer, but I'm going to sort of throw them both at you. Let's do the short one first, and it's one of my favorite examples of just, I'm sorry, what? So in 1840, the residents of the Norfolk Island Penal Colony, which is 800 miles from Australia, but under Australian governance, were granted a half holiday and a dinner of fresh pork in exchange for, and I quote, 3 hearty cheers for Old England, the Duke of Wellington, and the British Army from every man.
Who came up with that idea?
I presume it's the governor of the prison, sort of the commandant, if you will. But it is this amazing sort of moment of, no, you are the worst. You are quite literally, to borrow that phrase that Wellington has been quoted millions of times, the scum of the earth in the view of English society. But we are going to reinforce in you that you are British, and we're going to do this by bribing you with pork, in exchange for 3 cheers for Wellington, who more than supported transportation completely.
Oh yeah, signed off on it many times on his own soldiers.
On his own soldiers, yeah. The British Army, who in some of these cases at least were probably responsible for them being in irons.
Not only that, but actually some of them would have been ex-British soldiers kicked out of the army, transported as a felon overseas for crimes.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, Old England, a place where they were likely never to see again.
Literally the place they'd been kicked out of and told never to darken their door again.
Exactly.
Somebody's quite tone deaf, aren't they? When they come up with this idea.
What? Someone in the British Empire tone deaf? Never.
I know, it's a baffling concept.
But yeah, no, so that's one of my favorite sort of examples of just like, what? Yeah. But the other one that's a little bit more sort of, lets us get a little bit deeper, right, is Tasmania. So let's dig into Tasmania, and it's a good jump actually, because Tasmania starts as a penal colony, right? The British presence in Tasmania starts as a penal colony in the first decade of the 19th century. But basically what starts to happen is the guards who are stationed there who come back, the people who drop people off there and come back, or the very lucky few who manage to serve out their sentences and make it back, bring stories of the richness of the land. Like that place is teeming. And so more and more free settlers start to show up there. And expanding settlement basically soon brings the subjects of the British Empire, both those who are forced to be there and those who want to be there, into conflict with Tasmania's indigenous population. It's the old story, folks. We've all heard this one before. And this results in a near decade-long conflict that's known as either the Black War or the Tasmanian War. And the war is largely dominated by guerrilla tactics until the Europeans, the British, have had enough. And in 1830, basically there's this massive combined military and civilian offensive. It's christened the Black Line, that drives the entire Aboriginal population onto the Tasman Peninsula and then eventually onto neighboring islands, basically committing genocide in the process, right? Something like 20% of the entire population gets off, the rest die in the process. It's brutal. It's of that line, and it is one of those conflicts that is like, we need to write more about this, we need to read more about this, we need more of this on the record. But between the pressures of the penal colony and the racial paranoia driven by the sort of Black Tasmanian War, the development of a firm British and imperial identity that would override pre-existing social, economic, political, and national identities becomes crucial, right? You do not want your nearest white neighbor saying, I'm not going to help you because you're Welsh and I'm Scottish, right? You don't want that. You want everyone to be British. And military commemoration becomes a really powerful tool in achieving this. So there's the examples we've talked about already, right? In 1832, the mountain that overlooks Hobart, which has up until this point been called Table Mountain, is rechristened Wellington Mountain for obvious reasons. Cottage Green in Hobart itself becomes Salamanca Place. And the headquarters of Hobart's garrison becomes the Anglesey Barracks. Right, so there's all of this that's already there and built in, but also there is massive commemoration efforts around anniversaries, especially Waterloo and to a lesser extent Trafalgar. Trafalgar is particularly highlighted at one point because the governor of Tasmania, the lieutenant governor of Tasmania, was a midshipman on board a ship that fought at Trafalgar. He was at Trafalgar, so that obviously brings in specialization there. But what we start to see is this, very much this commemoration. There's dinners in the Hobart Garrison's mess. The barracks are illuminated. It gets to the point where there are multi-day events, right? There's an officer's mess one night and the sergeant major's ball the next. And all of these are mixed, right? It is the regiment and their ladies, and also, and I quote, a number of highly respectable civilians who had been invited upon the occasion. So it's that blend in a way that by the time we're talking about, right, this is the 30s and the 40s, you're starting to see a separation of commemoration in Britain itself into civilian and military circles. But here in Australia, and especially in Tasmania, because they're basically trying to say, no, we are that strong British Empire. You are safe with us. Don't worry. It is all united. And it even starts emphasizing the joint nature of these things. So in one year, for example, there's a dinner at the garrison, and then everyone who's invited to the dinner gets up, strolls through town, and attends a ball at Government House.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Is part of what's at play here, very specifically within the Tasmania example, about trying to sort of not quite militarize society, because that's a much bigger and sort of deeper process that you would need to engage in, but something perhaps akin to it. I can't quite put my finger on what the right word might be, but you talk about how, this is kind of a joint campaign that involves civilians as much as it does military individuals. Is part of this sort of, you bring people into the fold a little bit, you expose them to army culture, you make them feel a part of sort of the military celebration so they can feel part of a military, perhaps project is the wrong word. I'm dabbling in an area that I don't understand well at all, and I'm concerned that I'm sort of tripping over my tongue in the process, but I think you can kind of get what I'm thrusting at.
I do. And keep in mind, right, we've got two sides of this. To start with, right, this is fundamentally frontier settlement, which means it is automatically more military, more integrated, more violent than, say, Bath was at the time. just to pick another one that has these commemorations, right? And then there's the other side of it, which is that the black line that ends the Tasman War is a joint military civilian operation, right? It is, you get that sort of vibe. This is very much sort of the Australian version of what we see and what we sort of picture in sort of, say, the Transvaal, right? And that sort of the military and civilian farmer populations working together. So yeah, that is absolutely a part of this. Bring people in, get them working together. Also, they've met, they've mingled, and therefore they're going to be pissed off if they're not sharing this, right? It's about old comrades dining together and partying together. So that's absolutely part of it. And then, of course, for those who are new, for those who might be scared, for those maybe sort of as we come out of the war, there's also the reinforcement of sort of, no, we've got your back. We are here for you. Look at military might. There's an example. The second city of Tasmania is a place called Launceston. Launceston. I'm not from. I don't know my Tasmanian pronunciation, so I apologize to any of your listeners from that area if I've butchered that. But for the Waterloo anniversary in 1942, the population there is treated to a civilian Waterloo theatrical spectacle, a la what we've talked about in terms of Astley's Royal Amphitheatre or Vauxhall Gardens in London, at a place called the Victoria Theatre. And it's one of those big traditional, people pretending to be the military. But halfway through this, they clear the stage, and the entire military garrison of Launceston passes over it in review, going through the manual and platoon exercise and executing several brilliant movements. Now, if, for example, say a troop of the Household Cavalry showed up at Astley's and went, "Hey, we're joining you," not only would it have caused howls, but there would have been inevitable letters of sort of, why are we paying the wages of soldiers who are then lining the pockets of the owners of Astley's? But because it's the colonies, because it's compressed, and because the more important thing is to remind the population that the British Army is a force, that it is, young men in scarlet coats and polished steel that are there standing between you and that mystical, native terror, quote unquote. It's encouraged rather than horrifying, right? So there, very much that sort of back and forth, and we've got to get everyone thinking as Britons, and that's not just Welsh, Irish, Scottish, English. It's also civilian, military, naval, everything.
So we've got very dark with this because discussions of the British Empire tends to head in that direction, right?
This is this is going to be this is you guys are getting a little bit of a preview of what will end up being my second monograph at this point, which is on all of this. I joke that my first book is I get to write about parties. The second book I get to write about parties and genocide, which is that's going to be a tricky tonal line to sort of toe. But hopefully we get it right.
Yeah, the dichotomy is significant there, right? Yeah. And it's a dichotomy that I'm trying to navigate now, because having done let's emphasize that, an important aspect that needs discussing, we're now going to move on to tat. And there isn't an elegant way to bridge that divide. But I know you love a bit of Waterloo memorabilia, whether it's a Wellington knocker or a medal or a coin or whatever it might be. You like I'm not saying you like a bit of tat, but you do like a piece of Waterloo memorabilia. And some of it is just appalling. It's like Harry and Meghan plates that were created when the Sussexes got married, sort of thing. And it's big business when it comes to Waterloo. That just goes to show that such a phenomenon as those plates and the flags and all the rest of it is nothing new. So do we get much of that going on out in Australia? Is there an equivalent market out there?
Yeah, so what we don't get, at least to the same level, is production, right? A lot of it is coming from the metropole, from the homeland. Um, but yeah, no, we do get that, right? There are, uh, you know, in Australia and actually in India as well, the Times of India has a bunch of classified ads for paintings, which include prints of Waterloo, for books and histories. Australia does the same thing, right? And just to sort of jump on what you were saying, all of your listeners, think about how many times you've been wandering through or flipping through, say, the collection of an antique print stall at an antiques fair, the number of battle prints that you're going to find that are probably from 50 years after said battle, but that are there. Whether it's the cut up currier knives ones from the U.S. Civil War, or stuff from the Peninsular Wars and all of that. So yeah, there is 100% tat. What you see a lot of is Waterloo anniversaries being used as an excuse to order it, but stuff that's going to be used full time. So, for example, the Cricketer's Arms, right? That tavern in Sydney orders a new service of plate for the 1838 anniversary. But the feeling is, and the way it's written, it makes very clear that that plate is going to be their party plate for every event for the next 10 years, right? It's debuted at Waterloo, but it is not specifically. We're not talking about Apsley House, where there's a set that's brought out just for the banquet. He also, Green is the tavern owner there. He also buys and displays a bust of Wellington that sort of very possibly was shipped to Australia, and then he bought it at auction. He bedecks the front of his establishment with the colonial ensign, a large illumination of the words Wellington and Waterloo, and then that life-size bust of the Duke of Wellington, crowned with laurels. This is one of my favorite bits of this, actually, because in one year it is in the window crowned with laurels, but then he realizes that he can start having fun with this. So in 38, he leads the procession from the dinner into another apartment set apart for dessert, solemnly carrying the bust, which that year wore not only the Caesarean wreath, but the Masonic honors in blue, red, and black, and Mr. Green's Waterloo medal as a pendant from the sash. Another year, he's dressed in full Masonic costume, and in 42, he sports, and I quote, a new-fashioned cocked hat. So Wellington is setting the style trends not just at home with the Wellington boot, but in the 1840s in Australia with a new cocked hat.
I dread to think what he'd have said if he knew about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he would have been probably both amused and horrified. When Green carries the bust into the dessert room, by the way, they are greeted with "See the Conquering Hero Comes," being played by Mrs. Green on the pianoforte.
See, that bit I think he'd have quite liked, but
I mean, he certainly had no objection to being hailed with that. He was greeted that way at the at least at the Vauxhall commemoration in 1850, and I think it was 1850. At which point they strike that up, and everyone knows what it means, and so the concert completely loses its audience because they all flock to the entrance to see Wellington's entrance.
An 1850s bundle to go and see Wellington.
Exactly.
Who cares about the live music? Okay, so we don't get sort of the classic let's create some tat and flog it in the traditional style. Panoramas do show up though, right?
They do. They show up a little later, right? So first of all, one of the things that's worth noting about this is that in the ways of sort of imperial commemoration and imperial progression in general, it starts later and goes on later. So some of the prime examples that I've been talking about, I'm seeing through the 50s and into the 60s, at a time when in the UK they've mostly abandoned Waterloo. they've moved on to the Crimea. The panoramas are about the battle, Navarino and Arma and Sevastopol, things like that. And then of course they get on into the African campaigns and things like that, right? Omdurman and that sort of thing. But we do see panoramas start to show up. Philip Pito's there's a guy, an entrepreneur by the name of Philip Pito, and his Waterloo panorama tours Melbourne and Adelaide in the 1890s, and is hugely successful there. He tries there's a scandal story here which I think you'll get a kick out of. The 1893 panorama in Melbourne is touted / promoted / emphasized by a veteran of the battle, sort of one of the last older surviving veterans of the battle, who, because of the publicity that goes into this, it is revealed was born didn't join the army until 1820 and is a fraud. And because of this, he's kicked out of veteran housing and actually ends up in jail for vagrancy.
Serves you right.
Yeah.
Just don't.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of competition.
There is.
Sort of prodding, particularly over, who's the last. William Hewitt. Yes, there's a Napoleon and Revolutionary War Graves charity mention coming in here, people. No, I'm not sorry. William Hewitt, on his gravestone, the NRWGC recently redid the interior lining of his grave so that it wasn't clogged with weeds anymore, and instead it's got a nice kind of gravel layer restored to it, as it would have done back in the old days. Obviously, we did that in time for Waterloo. His gravestone very, very proudly attests to the fact that he was the last surviving English officer. That doesn't make him the last Brit, because that was an Irishman, and he's not the last survivor because that was actually a Prussian, not a Frenchman, as is often stated. So there's a lot of kind of competition for I was the last over this. Yeah,
there's also a Hanoverian that gets up there, I believe, quite late.
Mm-hmm.
There is absolutely there's a 75th anniversary panorama in 1890. That has its own sort of last surviving veteran, a Cornishman by the name of James Davy, and Ian Beckett did a little bit of digging in this in his new book on battle panoramas, and came to the conclusion that that man was also a fraud, because the only James Davy that got a Waterloo medal is in a very different regiment from the one that this gentleman claims to be a part of. Something that I, by the way, have also confirmed. I've gone through the Waterloo, the medal lists on that. I didn't just want to steal Professor Beckett's thunder on that one, but he is the one who sort of pointed it out. So fair play to him. One thing that you might be amused to hear about, though, is that the Waterloo panorama that shows up in Melbourne and Adelaide isn't from the United Kingdom. It's a U.S. production. So the U.S. was really big into panoramas, and they enjoyed their ones of battles. And so, after going through the entirety of the U.S. Civil War,
I was going to say, surely Civil War is the priority.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. Yeah, but after going through that, they decided they wanted some other ones, and Waterloo had enough name generation that they did it and then toured with it.
That's quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've done panoramas. Let's sort of start hopping around different bits of the empire and sort of looking at some of the things that happen elsewhere. And you've talked a bit already about the West Indies. Have we covered everything of significance that's... So we've talked about... Did we talk about the West Indies, actually?
We haven't talked about the West Indies yet.
Okay, I'm an idiot. We haven't talked about the West Indies. I'm just making things up in my head. Let's start by talking about the West Indies, shall we?
Fair enough. So the West Indies, you're going to get, unsurprisingly, right? It's going to be the planter class that's going to celebrate this.
You shock me.
I know. I know. It's breaking news at 11 here. But one of the things you do get, and it is actually really interestingly sort of along the lines of the anniversary party at the prison, at the penal colony. But in on the 23rd anniversary in 1838, Barbados celebrates by remitting the remaining periods of apprenticeship of several thousands of apprentices on various estates. For those of you who are unfamiliar with colonial language, apprenticeship in this case is not as in, oh, I'm going to learn to be a blacksmith. It's, what are we going to do about slavery now that we've outlawed slavery? So this is freeing several thousand, or freeing in inverted quotation marks as well, several thousand black laborers known as apprentices. In theory, they were learning how to farm. But that does happen. That also, by the way, that same thing happens in West Africa as well. That's sort of how they celebrate, is sort of remitting, ending apprenticeships of that type.
Is there any indication of gratitude for this ever so benevolent gesture? Is this very much sort of, yeah, great, you've given me what I should have been entitled to anyway?
I mean, that is definitely read into it. The problem is that's something I need to dig a little deeper into as of now. Right now, my sources for that are UK papers that aren't going to cover that, right? Unless they're, for example, the Chartist or something like that. They're not going to go there. So, but yeah, there has to have been just sort of, dear God, what? Can we stop already?
I mean, I think this is a very, very long shot. And apologies, folks, this has now descended into sort of down the pub, having a chat over a beer, kind of conversations that
a beer that neither of us drink.
Yeah, I know, but shush. Don't let the details come into this conversation, Reynolds. What are you on about? But I think it's a long shot. But if a slave song ended up mentioning, I don't know, anything to do with Napoleon or Wellington, I would be massively surprised. I think the nature of slave songs are brilliant. We should do a whole episode actually on slave songs. Some of them are utterly hilarious. They're so subversive, and the ability to really take the piss out of their owners, their overseers, is just magnificent. The way that they are actually a form of resistance in themselves. I would be staggered if they then started talking about Napoleon or Wellington. I don't know if Toussaint Louverture would make that, but I think you're going to be hard pushed to find much in the way of kind of slaves kind of going, yeah, Wellington, Waterloo, fantastic. This really matters to us. I mean, they've got bigger priorities in life,
Yeah, right. And if you're talking about sort of Napoleonic War military maneuvers that they're going to be most familiar with, it's going to be the Haitian Revolution, where every single army of Europe that claims to be fighting for liberation and independence is trying to put down this rebellion one after another, and getting summarily knocked off the island. Meanwhile, while doing everything up to and including inventing gas chambers in the hulls of ships. So yeah, this is not, sort of even the most diehard sort of the sort of pro-Napoleon Republicans in France sort of are not arguing that Napoleon is fighting for liberty and equality in the West Indies. Or at least I hope they're not, because if they are, then we need to have a talk.
Because actually they'll stand to lose a huge amount of money, which often is part of the problem here. Okay, so that's the West Indies picture. What's happening in India, a subcontinent that is literally feeling the consequences of Wellesley, aka Wellington's martial prowess, and who perhaps isn't remembered overly fondly by some of the inhabitants?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assessment. So again, we are seeing this very much of the elite. Yes, obviously the European elite, to a certain extent, especially as we move into the Victorian period and the High Raj, the co-opted elites as well, right? Get them to the parties the same way we get them honors, and that's how we lure them in and that sort of thing. But it's very much the elite. Again, the military is having a lot of fun. There's definitely examples of Waterloo being a day to seize upon if you are in a garrison in the middle of nowhere, say, northern frontier. Any excuse for a gathering is going to be a good one. But also in larger settlements, right? I've come across mentions of a Waterloo ball in Pune and a masquerade at Simla, which, by the way, was attended by Harding, then the governor. And the details of his they go into some speculation about costumes that are just the level of, I mean, it's the 19th century, right? But by our standards, reading this in the 21st, you're just like, oh, good God. You're one step away from sort of saying Johnny Chinaman here, right? It's like, it's that level of sort of cringe.
Again, you shock me.
I know, right? So yeah, what military banquets and celebrations in the cities, it's going to be to build up that same sort of military civilian guys allyship. Outside, it's going to be, we need entertainment for God's sakes. And then there are also a couple of civilian things. There's a grand military symphony, Waterloo in concert in 1840 in Bombay, that sort of thing. So, but it's yeah, you're right. The average Indian, the average resident of Bombay, of Bengal, or any of those, are not throwing their party for Waterloo, right? And I would gather that even any sepoys who are familiar with it and who mention it are going to be enjoying it because it is a half day. Like, that's the sole reason, right? It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, if you were a resident of Ahmednagar, for example, you're not going to remember the arrival of the British fondly under the command of Arthur Wellesley, so that doesn't entirely surprise me. You mentioned sepoys there. Do we have much information on how the East India Company kind of not negotiates Waterloo, because it doesn't need to negotiate, but sort of acknowledges, perhaps is a better word, in the sense that obviously it's important to the British Army. The British Army is part of what's propping up the East India Company, just as the East India Company Army is propping up the company's control over the region and protecting inverted commas its assets. Really going
no. In fairness, they are protecting their assets. The inverted
but they're also
protecting the region. Yes, yeah.
That's the main agenda here. We have an army that's here to protect our mercantile interests.
I mean, it would be a shame to waste it.
If you need to protect those financial interests by going out and acquiring new financial interests, that's this is how empires work during this period, right? But if
the people that are crossing the border to raid are on the other side of the border, they're not going to be raiding, and therefore it's peace.
Yes. Yes, so many sarcastic comments that we could make about this, aren't there? But what's the EIC's sort of engagement like, I guess, is what I'm asking when it comes to Waterloo.
So from what I've seen, and again, this is something I need to dig into, right? I do not have the source base for this yet. It is of that elite, we're going to party with the military to reinforce that bond. I would put a decent amount of money on at least half to 3/4 of those fund contributions that I talked about at the beginning, being East India Company officials, clerks, everything, and associated merchants and things like that. So yeah, it's very much, and I think it is of that, it's of that, like, we have to be British. Right. And I think there is genuinely, some delight towards the end of that, of, okay, maybe we can actually stop fighting the French in India for a little while. This might mean a form of peace. That is going to, we can fight, more of the Indians instead.
That's very much the EIC's kind of stance. Who do we fight for the biggest financial interest? Okay, so moving on from India, we've talked in the past about War of 1812 memorabilia in Canada. Folks, go back to there's an episode on memory and the War of 1812, a round table, a collection of the Dons, as I called it, because we had Don Hickey. Actually, did we have Don Hickey?
I believe we did, but we also had Alexander Nikabridze, who is a Don of the old school variety, if ever there was one.
Absolutely. But anyway, so you can hear more on how Canada remembers the War of 1812, as does the United States of America. But when it comes to kind of remembering Waterloo, where does this slot in? Do you end up with a kind of a friction between the War of 1812 mattering that much more to the Canadians, and yet Waterloo mattering probably more to the army, and so sort of creating a contested space? Or actually, is this just an opportunity to party even harder?
I think it is the latter more than anything, right? Waterloo is sort of folded into that War of 1812 memory. It's all part of the same thing. So yeah, it is an excuse to party even harder. What you see there again is pretty much the standard that we're setting in Australia, that we're setting to a certain extent in England itself, right? Military maneuvers, some sort of military celebration. It becomes common enough that by 1849, its absence is noted. We have paper reports basically going, where's this party? There's also civilians. The Highland Society of Canada enshrined into their rules, their constitution, that they hold a Waterloo banquet every year. Like, it is right there in black and white. Which I adore, is sort of, this is the problems that is facing Canada today. We don't have enough Waterloo banquets.
Does that get repealed at any point? Does somebody turn around and say, look, can we just kind of get a grip here? We don't need to have this party enshrined into law. We can just make it so in other means.
Not that I've seen, but again, that is, I've found the 1843 rules of the Highland Society. What I need to do is dig out like an 1890 rules and see if it's still in there, which is something I will do at some point, because it would be a fun question. We see the same military maneuvers. Actually, if you want something in bad taste that has nothing to do with race, this is a good example of it.
Finally, something that's distasteful, but not, racially distasteful.
Oh, God. In 1839, the Coldstream Guards, who are stationed in Quebec in the aftermath of the Canadian rebellions, reenact portions of Waterloo on the plains of Abraham.
Oh.
Which for those of you who don't know your 7 Years' War history, is where the British defeated the French and took Quebec at the end of the 7 Years' War.
Oh, so many messages being sent there, and none of them subtle.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah, I love that one, because it's reported as sort of like perfectly normal, like, oh, this is just normal, and then you're just like, you read further and you're like, okay, if you know your history, this is a lot.
That's staggering. I love that it's reported so nonchalantly as well, though.
Yeah.
Wow. The layers of to hell with the French within that. That's trolling.
Yeah,
19th
it really
century
is.
style, quite frankly.
It really is.
Okay, so prior to us coming, inverted commas, on air with this one, you said, ask me if there's anywhere else of interest, which is quite clearly an indication, having done a few of these with you, that you've got some pearl up your sleeve that's going to make my gob hit the floor. So go on, far away.
So how about memory of Waterloo in the middle of the Atlantic, roughly 900 miles east of the southern tip of Greenland?
Okay, go on. I'm interested. I thought you were going to say, like celebration in St. Helena or something.
Oh man, I wish. There is actually an island off the coast of Antarctica named Waterloo. It's part of the Russian-owned segment.
Okay.
But
that's interesting.
Yeah, I will look into St. Helena. I will look into St. Helena, because if I could find that. Speaking of trolling, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yes, we're gonna invite Napoleon to this dinner, and he might be bored enough that he might actually take us up on it. All right. So it's June of 1845, and two Royal Naval ships that most of your audience may have heard the names of tangentially are sailing across the Atlantic. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They're embarking on an attempt to find the Northwest Passage. It's an expedition that will cost the lives of both ships, 129 of their men, and become one of the enduring mysteries of 19th century British maritime exploration, to the point where there are horror novels written about it. And on June 18th, 1845, the officers of both ships are gathered around Sir John Franklin's table on board HMS Erebus to toast the Duke of Wellington and Waterloo. Because as Commander James Fitzjames notes in his journal, today is Waterloo Day. Now, here's the fun part. Franklin, who is hosting this, can call upon experience, because Franklin was one of the lieutenant governors of Tasmania in Hobart when they were partying. So
the circle gets completed.
It does. It does.
Although, as a complete aside, just kind of, sorry, this is very unacademic in terms of where my mind's gone with this, but you were just talking about kind of horror novels and Waterloo toasts. I can just imagine somebody with a hyperactive imagination spinning some kind of horror story series that involves, like the ghost of Wellington, and, toast him on the 18th of June, and suddenly he appears in a mirror or something, and this is genuinely a horrifying prospect in and of itself. You don't need to turn it into a horror novel, but you can imagine we've got Wellington the Vampire as a series, so surely that's not too far-fetched as a concept.
No, not at all. Just look in your mirror and say Wellington was a defensive general 5 times.
Oh, I'm not sure Wellington will appear, but a very angry Marcus Cribb will chase after you.
That is
with
certainly
sharp
true.
Sword.
That is certainly true.
In tow. Okay.
This is one of these things where belief makes it possible, so I don't want to give Marcus the ability to move through mirrors. That sounds genuinely terrifying.
Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to look in the mirror and then suddenly find, and I say this with much love in my heart, but nobody wants to get up first thing in the morning, look in the mirror and find Marcus Cribb staring back at them. That is genuinely a terrifying prospect, and I'm sure even Marcus would agree with me on that one. Okay, so one last question to wrap all of this up. We've looked very much at the perspective out in the colonies, but what's the view on all of this back in the metropole, back in the UK? Because it's not much of a stretch to imagine some pretty patronizing comments, because let's face it, Western Europeans are very good at patronizing comments about pretty much everybody, whether it's an indigenous population or actually a colonial settler population. But it's easy to imagine somebody sort of looking on and going, oh, well, isn't this terribly quaint? Look at these people out in the colonies. They're sort of celebrating Waterloo Day, trying very hard to demonstrate their loyalty to good old Great Britain. You can well imagine it. Do you see those kinds of comments coming from folks in London?
Not that I've seen. What you see is, and I think this ties into one of the earlier questions we had, you see a lot of self-congratulation. You see these reports as proof of the size and security of the empire. I think this is one of these things where had they, for example, had there been reports of them celebrating minor scuffles in their own stations, then it would have been, oh, look at them, aren't they cute? But because it's Waterloo, it's genuinely seen as, no, we, the sun never sets. Everything our shadow touches is ours, right? It's that sort of thing. And it's self-congratulation. We do see very much sort of reports of these celebrations to a certain extent in the home newspapers. What we also see, and I think this is telling, is we see a large amount of reports in the empire about the London celebrations, Waterloo banquets, things like that, right? Especially in India, there is sort of a, you know, almost an annual sort of, the Duke of Wellington held his annual banquet, sort of just to reinforce those ties, and presumably also to generate ideas, right? You read about this happening in London, you're like, oh, that's a great idea, let's do it here, right? And suddenly the Hobart, another Hobart dinner is born, or that sort of thing.
Luke, it's always fascinating to talk to you. Dr. Memory doing what he does best there, folks. Folks, if you haven't got your hands on a copy of Who Owned Waterloo, Oxford University Press is the place to go. But thank you very much for your time today, and I'll look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.
Always a pleasure, Zach. Thank you for having me, and thank you to your listeners for their indefatigable interest in this period.
The estimable Dr. Luke Reynolds there. If you haven't already followed him on Twitter, he's at Lou Reynol, Lureynol. He's one of the ones to watch, folks, among the rising generation of historians. A reminder, you can get your hands on the paperback of Who Owned Waterloo and enjoy 30% off if you head to Oxford University Press's website and quote code AAFLYG6. Once again, that is Alpha Alpha Foxtrot Lima Yankee Golf 6. Folks, you know the drill by now. If you're new here, remember to hit that subscribe button so that you can find your way back. And if you're loving the show, remember to leave a review. It makes a vast amount of difference in terms of helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love to all of my Patreon supporters who hopefully are going to start enjoying some slightly different elements of the perk package. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, Ulrich Decado, James Flueck, Roger O'Donnell, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Malinsky, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Jason Moran, and Mark Chestnut. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Led Campbell, Graham Swidenbank, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Steve Carter, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, and Tim Day. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Witness history at Roland Garros, where old rivalries meet new talent on the clay battleground. Tennis Channel Plus is your place to watch. Stream every court from your phone or smart TV live in HD. Experience 3 weeks of unparalleled access as the world's top players in tennis face off to see if the veterans maintain their dominance or if a fresh face rises to challenge them. Daily live coverage of the French Open begins Monday, May 20th. Stream it now with Tennis Channel Plus to be there when it happens.
Planning for your next trip? Elevate your travel style with Quince. Quince has all the jet-setting essentials you'll want for your next getaway, like European linen, premium luggage options, buttery soft Italian leather bags, and so much more. And it's all priced at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe and ethical manufacturing practices. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials you'll be wearing for vacations to come with Quince. Go to quince.com/trip for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Cats and cat owners deserve better than any old-fashioned litter. That's why I teamed up with scientists and veterinarians to create Pretty Litter. Its innovative crystal formula has superior odor control and weighs up to 80% less than clay litter. Pretty Litter even monitors health by changing colors to help detect early signs of potential illness. It's the world's smartest kitty litter.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.